Hello, and welcome to Socialism, the weekly Marxist analysis podcast from the Socialist Party. The Honda car manufacturing plant in Swindon is threatened with closure by 2021, with a loss of 3,500 jobs. The Socialist Party has raised the idea of nationalisation to save those jobs, and calls on the trade unions and Jeremy Corbyn to build a fighting campaign based on action by the workers. But what type of nationalisation should be carried out? Is it feasible? Why is it such an important demand for socialists? Over to Sarah Rack for this interview, which was recorded on the 7th of March.
Okay, today I'm talking to Rob Williams, who's the National Industrial Organiser for the Socialist Party. Hi, Rob.
Hiya.
And we're going to be talking a bit about the demand for nationalisation and socialist nationalisation, but we're going to start with, I think, Rob, you were on the protest recently with the Honda workers. So can you explain a bit about what is proposed to happen at the Honda plant in Swindon?
Yeah, well, yesterday there was a protest by the Honda Workers Unite outside Parliament, and for people to know, there's going to be a demonstration in Swindon where the plant is located over the next few weeks. One of the dates they're looking at is March the 30th. And I call on all trade unionists to come to that demonstration, because this is a massive issue. This is a plant of 3,500 workers who are collectively facing the dole queues in the next couple of years. And it's estimated that perhaps another 12,000 jobs in the supply chain are affected, many of them in that immediate area. So we're talking about a massive plant, really, in British terms, facing extinction in over the next year or two, and that's a vital issue, I think, for all workers. There's other plants as well. I've got a lot of friends in the Bridgend Ford engine plant, and they themselves are facing the winding up of that plant. So there's a lot of insecurity out there, and of course a lot of workers will be asking themselves, well, what can we do to stop our factories, our plants disappearing? And that's why I think the issue of nationalisation, of public ownership, is such a key and concrete issue right now.
So on that question then of what can be done, what can workers do, and particularly what is the Socialist Party raising in terms of what the trade unions and also the Labour Party leadership, Jeremy Corbyn and so on, should be doing in response to this threat?
Well, first of all, obviously, in an immediate sense, this is an industrial issue, and I want to make this clear. The shop stewards and the trade union, the convener in Honda in Swindon, are big supporters of the National Shop Stewards Network. We've built a relationship with them over a decade now. The convener, Paddy Brennan, was facing a sack in 2011, and we, along with many others, helped the campaign there and successfully got his reinstatement. And of course, the trade union in Honda will be discussing and in other places about, what industrial action they can take. Yesterday, for instance, on the day we had the protest in Parliament, there were workers there from Belgium, I think Spain as well, and they were actually taking action in their respective countries in Honda. And of course, that's something that the workforce will have to discuss, and we will support them in any action that they take. And, history has taught us that when workers take militant action, then they can put pressure on companies to reverse their decision. And actually, we'll go on to explain, they can actually force governments to intervene as well, with either state aid or even by taking the company themselves into public ownership. So many times it's the industrial action that workers have been prepared to take that has done that. I want to give one example right now, and that is in 1971, the Upper Clydeside shipyards that was facing closure. The workforce did what they called a work-in, which is almost like a working occupation of the shipyards. That had a huge effect, not just in Scotland, but throughout Britain. They called a demonstration of 80,000 workers. It put massive pressure on the then Tory government of Edward Heath, who was forced, against his will, to intervene at that stage. So obviously the immediate response is for the union in Swindon and any other of these plans to discuss what action they feel they could take that can really raise the stakes, send a message to the company and everyone else that we're not accepting this. What I saw yesterday on the protest was a determined set of workers and shop stewards that clearly want to send a signal to Honda. They're not accepting this closure, and they're discussing the action that they can take to get the campaign going.
And so, but you've mentioned that one of the ideas that we're raising is the possibility of nationalisation to save the jobs. And this is a demand that this isn't the first time we've raised it, is it? In fact, when there's this type of threat, it's often an idea that the Socialist Party will raise. Why is that? Why is it such an important demand to raise?
Yeah, I think because in the end, these companies will make decisions based on their own, in the interest of their profits. And there's an old saying that, what you don't own, you can't control. And the fact is that what happens when a private company makes a decision to close a factory, then I'm sure many, all the politicians will say, and all others, well, that's their decision. They own the company in that way. We don't take that view. We take the view that in reality, who should own the company is the workers involved in that company and the community that stands by the side of it. That we take a view, what is necessary for workers to have a decent life, and therefore that comes first in our struggle. And in reality, if these companies can't provide that future, then we have to take steps to take that industrial plant out of their control and for the common good. And the way to do that is to take it into public ownership, to nationalise those companies. I mean, this is a demand, for instance, that we raised almost exactly 3 years ago when the steelworks in Talbot, very similar situation, very similar size plant actually in terms of workers, very similar situation, a town almost totally reliant on that works. And we, I think, played an important role in popularising the idea of taking that into public ownership. Of course, that was a plant that was once in public ownership. It was part of a publicly owned steel company in Britain. And that caught the imagination. When you look back to 2016, even David Cameron, believe it or not, because of the size of the threat, really, I've got no doubt as well, what also played a role was that it was months before the EU referendum as well. But even Cameron had accepted, at least in principle, the possibility of the steelworks being part nationalised or temporarily nationalised. And that, it just shows that we have to take advantage of every opportunity. And now, for instance, this is a government, a Tory government that is weak and divided. It's really in a very difficult situation as far as concerned. And therefore, it is possible, we believe, that if we, popularise the idea of public ownership as a way forward for those workers and those other workers who are affected, then huge pressure can be put on this government. Again, back in 1971, Rolls-Royce, which has got a factory not a million miles from Swindon in Filton in Bristol, that company was taken into emergency public ownership, again by Heath, because it was facing liquidation. It was facing whole-scale redundancies and closures. They were forced into that step, and therefore it's about building up the pressure and putting the demands, even on a Tory government, by the way, to take necessary steps to make sure that this industrial carnage doesn't happen.
So I think we should kind of look at some examples of nationalisation, some of kind of which you've just referenced. But there have even been nationalisations in recent memory, haven't there? And particularly maybe stands out is the kind of partial nationalisations of the banks in following the economic crisis 2007, 2008. But that is not the type of nationalisation we're calling for, is it?
No, but the point, you make a very good point, actually. So therefore, to those cynics and pessimists, to those who will argue, about the right of business to manage itself and this is their property. Well, we didn't get that from the banks in 2007, 2008. In effect, emergency action was taken to shore up the banking system in that way. So on one level, yes, it does show, so what's good for the finance sector? Why can't we take those steps for manufacturing industry as well? And it shows it's not off limits. It is an absolutely acceptable step that can be taken. But you are right. We do call for something different, because what happened then was the banking system, the most parasitic section of capitalism, that section who more than any other has sought to undermine the gains the working class people have made, of public ownership, the welfare state, etc. They were fully prepared to use the state to save the banking sector and the financial system at that time. But of course, what happened then was that nationalisation really was us, i.e. the public. We nationalised the debt at that time. And of course, in a number of occasions, what they did was they used the state, they exploited the state to save those banks, and then as quick as they possibly could, then they refloated them in the private sector. So you're right. We don't want nationalisation to save the fat cats. We want to replace the fat cats. The nationalisation that we are calling for is taking those industries out of the hands of the fat cats, never to go back in their hands ever again. They clearly can't be trusted to run those industries or financial services in the interest of the majority of society. We believe that they should be run under workers' control and management. I can assure you, as an ex-car worker myself, that those factories don't need to be run by any billionaire businessman and all the rest of it. In reality, they can be run by the workers in those factories, those workers, engineers, etc. As a very important step. Now, we don't stop there, and I'm sure we'll discuss that in a minute. We think the whole economy should be run on that basis. So yes, we call for we're not calling for nationalisation to save capitalism. We are calling for nationalisation that, in the immediate sense, saves those jobs, saves those industries, but in a wider sense, would be an important, a stepping stone, or important step rather, of a different type of socialist society.
And maybe another example that stands out in people's minds is the period after World War II, when there were quite, large-scale nationalisations in Britain. So what about that period of time compared to what we call for?
Yeah, I mean, it's worth knowing, by the way, that taking those companies into, taking important sectors of the economy into public ownership, obviously went on for quite a long time, because even the, not just the immediate post-war era, but even up to the 1970s, then what became known as British Leyland, so an important sector of the British car industry was taken into public ownership by the, by the Wilson-Callaghan Labour government after 1974 at that stage. And of course, I think the phrases we sometimes use in Britain after the war, we had almost a quarter of a revolution. We had big sectors of the economy taken into public ownership. That was the era of taking coal into public ownership. I think steel, and then the Tories privatised, and it was back into public ownership. And of course, it's been privatised since the NHS, etc. And of course, that was important. The miners had been fighting for nigh on half a century to nationalise the coal industry, to take that industry out of the hands of the mine owners. And it was a very important step. It did, show that, we didn't have to rely on private industry to run society. But of course, there were defects. And that was that too often the mine owners or their like became managers of that industry. It wasn't done in the sense of looking to have a totally different type of socialist society. So in reality, they became islands, sometimes quite big islands, but nevertheless islands of socialism within capitalism, and of course run very much in that way. And we don't stand for that. That type of nationalisation was used then by those who wanted to take these industries back into private ownership, the likes of Thatcher, etc. That they were ridiculed, if you like, and lambasted. Of course, it's important for us to defend even those nationalised industries to a certain extent. When you look at the railways, the absolute robbery of the railways, basing it on public subsidy right now. But of course, we that is not the nationalisation that we stand for. We stand on the basis of workers' control and management, and not individual units of public ownership. We stand for a socialist plan of production based on a nationalised economy. Perhaps not every corner shop being nationalised, but the main bulk of the industrial and financial units in society being taken into public ownership, a plan of production, so they have to be run in the interests of the vast majority of society. So we could so we can create a socialist plan that looks at what people require in society. The one difference being, of course, that society will own those productive units, and that is an important, not important. That is an absolutely crucial step.
And that kind of planning allows you to address other issues as well, doesn't it? Like the podcast that we did recently with Chris Boff on the environment, for example, and he raised the fact that if you have nationalisation, you can begin to look at how things are produced to do so in a way that's less damaging to the environment and so on, but that's only possible on the basis of being able to plan across the economy. So some of these ideas of nationalisation of some industries and so on have been raised by Jeremy Corbyn, haven't they? And particularly in his 2017 election manifesto, and they were very popular demands, weren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, exactly. It just shows these demands are popular, particularly, I think, the nationalisation of the railways and the transport network. It's an absolute disaster. When you see the amount of cancellations we've seen, the amount of profits made by these companies. And of course, don't forget the hypocrisy. These are companies that rely on public subsidy to make their profits. And of course, what we've also seen, not just in the rail network, but also in the energy network as well, we've seen companies, publicly owned companies from other countries buying into, the British transport and energy networks as well. So, yeah, it just shows they're very popular, and it shows people have gone through the experience of privatisation. I'm old enough, unfortunately, to remember when we had the Thatcher privatisations in the early 1980s, this idea that Britain was going to become this share-owning democracy, that everyone could buy shares. And of course, for a short time, people perhaps were taken in by that. Of course, what they took advantage of, that the shares were sold at rock bottom of prices, and then they could make a quick markup. But in reality, that's gone. No one talks about that anymore. What people's experience is privately owned companies, exploiting workers, making mass profits. The rise in the energy prices, the rise of transport prices, etc. That's the everyday experience of privatisation, and people are open and actually demanding. It's incredibly popular, the idea of taking things back into public ownership. And of course, we need to build on that. I just want to make the point that where we would, I think, differ. Of course, we would differ on a number of aspects to Jeremy Corbyn's manifesto, which was a very important step. But obviously, we think it should go much further. But we want the immediate renationalisation of the rail network, for instance. The idea of waiting for these companies to, finish their franchise lives, then we're not in favour of that. They should be taken immediately into public ownership. The idea of compensation on proven need, we shouldn't be compensating the fat cats. They've earned enough out of these contracts. It's different, perhaps pension funds or workers' pensions or small savers, etc. That's something that could be discussed and negotiated. But we want those industries immediately nationalised. But I think what's important is even those quite large-scale parts of the industry on their own will be islands of socialism, and if the main bulk of the economy is in the hands of the capitalists, they will do everything in their power to sabotage. They want to wreck the image of nationalisation and public ownership, and they did that in the past. They'll move heaven and earth to ridicule and damage that idea. So therefore, for us, it's not an end in itself. They're important steps, but we want them part of a overall plan of nationalising the economy, of socialist planning and public ownership.
So to come back to Honda and other similar kind of threats to jobs, maybe we can discuss a bit how that relates to the general political situation in Britain at the moment, because I think there's a bit of a narrative that Brexit is what is behind a lot of these threats to the kind of those industrial jobs. But the Socialist Party's pointed out that that's a real distortion of the role that the EU has played for those workers and industries, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, Britain has been part of the forerunner of the European Union since 1973, and then obviously the European Union. And in that time, manufacturing is probably a quarter of it was. Number of manufacturing jobs is a quarter of it what it was in that time. The amount of industries that's left in that whole period. And of course, we've had the development of globalization, which has reinforced the neoliberal character of the European Union. And of course, a major part of that is the race to the bottom. So that means attacking workers' rights here in the UK, but also, where possible, exporting jobs to low-wage economies in the European Union and elsewhere as well. Now, clearly, we can't ignore the concerns that workers will have. It is entirely possible that the deluge of propaganda from the mainstream media, who, let's remember, represent the interests of British capitalism, are in the main pro-EU. And by the way, if they're for Brexit, it's in the interests of big business. Then, of course, you can have workers, understandably, who might think that this is because of Brexit. That avalanche of propaganda, which the companies themselves are buying into. So we have to be aware of that, but we also got a responsibility to explain that the deindustrialisation that's happened in Britain over an whole period has got nothing to do with Brexit. It's about these multinational companies maximising their profits in that way. And therefore, what we have to point out is that how can workers maintain their jobs, their living standards for them and their families? And therefore, we have to, that is only possible by challenging and overthrowing the rule of big business, of capitalism, and bringing in an alternative society based, as I've said, on socialist public ownership and a plan in that way. So we have to be mindful of workers' concerns, and therefore our position is we want a Brexit, if you like, in the interests of workers that doesn't adhere to the neoliberal rules. For instance, one of which is on public ownership. The EU has rules against state aid, nationalisation, etc. We totally oppose to that, like all the other anti-worker policies of the European Union. But of course, how do we put forward a position that recognises that at the moment a lot of workers can be divided on this issue, and therefore the way forward for us is a general election that can bring together workers on either side of the Brexit divide. And we think either side of the Brexit divide, the same issues prevail. That is insecurity, worries about the future, worries about jobs, pay, etc. But a general election that gives the opportunity to bring in a Labour government led by Jeremy Corbyn. Of course, we want that government on socialist policies, like we've described, to get rid of the Tories, than to bring in a new stage really for workers to fight behind. Of course, as I've already outlined, we have criticisms. We think that programme, that manifesto doesn't go far enough. But nevertheless, it would definitely been a big step forward for workers. And our position is that by mobilising workers, we can, put pressure on such a Corbyn-led Labour government. And actually, that pressure is vital because left to their own devices, the capitalists will put massive pressure on Corbyn. We see that now with the attacks in and outside the Labour Party. The capitalists will put enormous pressure on Corbyn to retreat from his programme. And therefore, it's vital that we mobilise workers, not just to fight for a Corbyn-led Labour government, but to ensure that that government sticks to its manifesto and, in fact, moves further to the left, moves further in the direction of socialist policies.
Okay, thanks very much for joining us, Rob.
We'd like to hear your thoughts on today's episode or ideas of what you'd like to hear in future episodes. Send us an email to socialismpodcast@socialistparty.org.uk and check out some further reading on the topic at socialistparty.org.uk/podcast. And don't forget to click subscribe and leave us a 5-star review in your podcast app.